welcome to Learning is Not Quiet presents Conquering the Kingdoms. Today we are going to go through taxonomy, but now looking at specific examples and applying things that you probably learned already in science to the system of taxonomy. So if you have not watched my video on taxonomy, that's very important to have some background knowledge before we get into this. Quick review, just remember that the system of organization is domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. And if you say that to yourself 10 times, you will remember it forever. The other way we remember it is through the acronym King Philip came over for good soup. Kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. So without further ado, let's go over the housekeeping things. If you're a parent or teacher who are finding this on YouTube, note that there are links in the description that will bring you to my Teachers Pay Teachers store and give you the paper or digital worksheets that go with this, as well as other activities on taxonomy, biology, and so much more. If you're a student, note that words in all capital letters are usually very important. They usually correspond to a blank you need to fill in on your paper worksheet or the answer to a question on your digital worksheet. Let's get started. So the first classification, that we're going to talk about is domain, and there are two domains. They're prokaryotic or eukaryotic. Most organisms on Earth are unicellular, which is weird for us to think about because when we go to the zoo, we're not like, oh, look at the cute bacteria. But bacteria are everywhere, even though we can't see them. There are millions of trillions of them, even in your own body. So most diversity of life is found in these unicellular organisms. There are more species of life that are unicellular, have one cell. So bacteria is in this domain prokarya. These are simple prokaryotic organisms, no nucleus, very simple structure. They live inside you and me. Sometimes they make us real sick. Sometimes they actually help us. You would die right now if you got rid of 100% of the bacteria that live inside your body. Crazy, right? Archaea is very similar to bacteria in that they're prokaryotic organisms, but they're much more closely related to eukaryotic organisms than they are bacteria. They're able to survive in super harsh environments like volcanoes, hot springs, really hot or really cold temperatures. They're probably the oldest types of organisms on planet Earth. And kind of fun fact, we've just discovered, as of taping this video a few weeks ago, that there might be some archaea in the atmosphere of Venus. I highly recommend you go check it out after you're finished watching this wonderful video, because we found some of the products that might have come from prokaryotic archaea type of systems. If not, there's new chemistry that we haven't discovered yet, but that's a whole, again, go look at it after you finish watching this video. So that was prokaryotic. Remember, simple, prokaryotic, simple. Then we have eukarya. These are complicated, multicellular organisms with eukaryotic cells. Everything you see on your screen right now, including myself, is an example of a eukaryotic organism. Most of the things that you think of fall into this domain, because we're not usually looking around in our life going, oh, that awesome bacteria over there. We're usually like, oh, the cute puppy, the eukaryotic, right? Most of the stuff you can think of is eukaryotic. Any animals or plants that you can think of are eukaryotic. And that brings me to my next system of classification, moving on from domain and now going to kingdom. So domain, kingdom, there are kingdoms of eukarya. Of course, there are kingdoms of prokaryotic organisms, but we're going to focus on eukaryotic right now. And so the four kingdoms of eukarya are Animalia, Plantae, Fungi, and Protista. So protists are unicellular organisms, and I know you're like, wait a minute, I thought unicellular was prokaryotic. Well, there are actually some complicated protista or complicated unicellular organisms that are actually complicated enough to be considered eukaryotic. This is a scientific gray area or a weird part of taxonomy. Some protists make their own food and are more like plants, algae. Some eat other organisms and like animals and are kind of like animals, like amoeba. Definitely an interesting area of study. More awesome science things to check out after this video. We're going to move on to fungi. Fungi are organisms, decomposers, or things that get their energy from dead organisms. They're heterotrophs, which means they get their energy from something else. They don't create it themselves. This includes mushrooms, yeast, molds, and other organisms that break stuff down. Overwhelmingly, and I know this is a shocker, fungi don't move. That's part of their classification. Next, we have plantae, or plants. These are organisms that are autotrophs, auto meaning self. They get their energy from the sun and photosynthesis. They create their own food. They feed themselves. They are green because they have chlorophyll. They have plant cells with chloroplasts and cell walls. Again, more videos coming out about that later. And they do not move. I know, shocker. Plants don't move. Finally, we have animalia. These are organisms that are heterotrophs, or get their energy by eating plants and other animals. They include humans, frogs, lizards, butterflies, spiders, giraffes, sloths, sharks, and jellyfish. They all fall in this category, and universally, they almost all move. So now we've done domain, kingdom. Now we're going to move on to phylum. First, we're going to talk about plant phylum and then animal phylum. So plant phylums, and I have a whole video on just plant organization, a whole song. So if you need a refresher, pause and go check that out first. But phylum of plants, we have mosses, ferns, gymnosperms or conifers, and flowering plants, also known as angiosperms. So mosses are plants that grow in large groups close to the ground, as pictured here, and they're usually found in these moist, wet environments. Ferns are plants with stems and leaves that reproduce asexually. So what that means is they basically break off a tiny little spore, a tiny little cell, and that is then able to create a new plant. They don't have to combine with another type of plant to create new life, of another plant of the same species to create new life. They don't have flowers, fruits, or seeds. Instead, they have spores. And the same thing is true with mosses. They have spores, not seeds. Ferns, we think, are actually the oldest type of plant on Earth. Gymnosperms, also known as conifers, also known as Christmas trees, they have seed-producing plants, most of which have cones. So, and you've seen this before either on your Christmas tree or walking outside, especially if you live somewhere kind of cold. Gymnosperms have these like needle-like structure leaves, and this is to help them survive and adapt against the cold. They also have cones that release their seeds, right? And that's how they protect their seeds. Finally, we have flowering plants. Flowering plants are also known as angiosperms. They have flowers and fruits for producing those plants. And flowers have so many different parts and all of this kind of stuff. Again, check out other videos. They explain it a little bit more. We're applying what we've previously learned. Okay, so now we're going to talk about animal phyla. This is where it gets very complicated. If you don't understand all of this right away, totally fine. Just take a deep breath. The main one I want you to know when you're done with this is chordata. So chordata, chordata, chordata. I'm going to go through the whole history in a few minutes of animals. But at the end of the day, the most important one to know is chordata. So animal phyla. In general, they're categorized as vertebrates having a backbone, chordata, or invertebrates not having a backbone. So first, evolutionarily speaking, we have porifera, or sponges. They're the most simple of all animal phyla. They're the oldest evolutionarily. They don't move, they don't filter food, and they have no specialized cells or tissues. They're so unspecialized that you could actually take a sponge living in the ocean, you could put it in a blender, you could blend it around for a little bit, and it would still be totally fine. I mean, I don't recommend doing that because, salinity and all these things, but still, isn't that crazy? They don't have any specialized cells. You can just tear them apart and put them back together. Me and SpongeBob kind of proves that. He's not the brightest creature on Nickelodeon, but that's for another discussion. The next came Cnidaria, are jellies, sea anemone, and coral. They're a little bit more complicated than sponges because they actually have specialized cells. They can take stuff in and digest it, but they don't really have any organisms. Very important difference. With a jellyfish, you couldn't put it in a blender, blend it up, and have jellyfish, right? They have specialized cells, specialized body parts. Next came unsegmented flatworms. I love this. You can see this in the Finding Nemo, and I always point it out every single time I watch Finding Nemo as they're going to the drop-off. But they're platythynthumices, whatever. They're the first organisms to have 3 layers of tissues or specialized organized systems. They have 2 separate openings for taking in and getting rid of food. Just take a moment to appreciate the unsegmented flatworms, okay? All of the organisms, all the animals before that had only one hole for taking in and getting rid of food. Not very pleasant, right? So thank you, unsegmented flatworms, that we have a hole for our mouth and a different hole in our butt. Yay! I'm so glad that you existed so that I can be a more complicated creature now. Woohoo! Okay, next we have nematoda. These are unsegmented roundworms. They're really small. They live in the soil, sometimes in water, and sometimes in humans. Ah! They're more complicated because they have a mouth, a stomach, and an anus. Bam! Then we have the Cambrian explosion, and this is when life gets really interesting. From here, we then have mollusca. These include snails, hi Gary, octopi, squids, and they move. They have very specialized tissues, right? Again, ever since the sponge, you cannot take those cells, mix them up, and they'd be fine. It really matters. From here, we have annelids, which are also known as worms. They're more complicated animals, such as leeches and earthworms, that have segments. They have those little individual parts. Then we have arthropods, very important category of Animalia. They're even more complicated animals with no vertebrae. They have segmented bodies and a hard exoskeleton. So they're starting to almost look and feel like they have a skeleton or a backbone, but they're still invertebrates. There's tons of them on planet Earth. They include everything from crayfish and lobsters and crabs to ladybugs and butterflies. All of these things are arthropods. And finally, like I said, most important is chordata. This is where we get all of the vertebrates, big animals like us, giraffes, sloths, and monkeys. Let's dive even deeper into chordata class and finally species. So the chordata class has 5 parts: reptiles, birds, fish, amphibians, and mammals. Fish are animals that live entirely underwater. Key characteristics are they have gills to breathe and they lack limbs with digits, right? You never see a fish with hands or fingers if you really think about it. Reptiles are cold-blooded animals that lay eggs and have scales. Quick point about cold-blooded. Cold-blooded means that they have to move for homeostasis. So they can't just shiver to get warmer and they can't sweat to get cooler. They have to literally move around to get hotter or colder. That's why you often see reptiles like turtles chilling out on rocks because they want to heat up and then they jump back in the water when they need to cool down. Next is amphibians, not to be confused with reptiles. Amphibians are animals that live in aquatic environments, and the big difference between them and reptiles is they start out as larvae in the water. Reptiles, remember, they come from hard-shelled eggs. They have a moist, thin, smooth skin. Next, we have birds. Birds are feathered, warm-blooded animals. So these are animals that can do homeostasis. They can make themselves warmer and cooler. They are winged, and they have 2 legs and they are 2-legged and are egg-laying. Key point about birds: not all birds fly. So penguins, for example, are still classified as birds. They lay hard eggs. They are warm-blooded. They have wings, but they do not fly. They use those wings to swim instead. Finally, we have mammals. Mammals are warm-blooded animals, right? We can shiver, we can sweat. They have hair, they have mammary glands, and they do not lay eggs. We all give live birth, which is actually really important that we don't lay eggs. And mammals actually take care of their babies. I mean, right? You don't just see a fish, unfortunately, like Finding Nemo. In real life, fish don't really take care of their babies, but mammals, we almost all do. And that's because we give live birth to them. We don't just lay the eggs and leave them. And we teach our offspring things through this time of nurturing. Okay. And finally, species. So we have domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. So what makes a species? A species is the ability to mate and produce fertile offspring. So kind of a weird example is we can actually marry together a lion and a tiger, and it can produce a tigon or a liger, which is a half lion, half tiger situation. But that's not a new species because that liger or tigon cannot mate with another liger or tigon and produce a liger or tigon. They're infertile. They can't have babies. So that's kind of an overview of this system of taxonomy of domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, and hopefully you've learned a little bit of your previous science skills and are able to apply it to this awesome system. Have a wonderful day, and thank you so much for joining me. Adios.